During the 1850s, Spain was in the midst of political unrest. The winds of change sweeping across the Iberian Peninsula were caused by various failed governments of Queen Isabella. The times were very precarious for the nobility caste, forcing many of the aristocracy to leave Spain for the Spanish colonies in the New World. Don Alfonso Rodriguez and Doña Florinda González de Rodriguez, both of esteemed noble descent and wealth, sold their extensive properties and left Spain to join other nobility in the Spanish colony of Honduras. The young couple arrived at Juticalpa, the capital of the Olancho province, one of the richest of Honduras. The province was renowned for its illustrious and wealthy inhabitants as well as its welcoming of the new arrivals from Spain. Don Alfonso began to prosper with his business ventures, and he built a beautiful mansion. And together they had 4 daughters, Luz Maria, Delfina, Carlota, and Jesucita. All 4 being close in age enjoyed a blissful life running like white butterflies amongst the perfumed forest of charming meadows. But fate decided one day in May to bring tragedy into their life. Carlota at the age of 5 and Jesucita at the age of 3 were found by Doña Florinda motionless in their beds, their beautiful faces covered with the pallor of death. They had died of a rare throat infection. The entire community of Juticalpa grieved over the sorrow and sadness inflicted on the family. The tragedy was frightfully painful for the Doña, and deeply affected the hearts of the Rodriguez couple. Don Alfonso decided to help cope with their loss by taking his wife away for a few months. They traveled to various places in Central America. Upon their return, more relaxed and calmer, they continued their life back home in the mansion. Both Maria Luz and Delfina were entrusted to a woman they called Mama Chica, who was hired, as was the tradition, to raise and educate their children. Both girls were strikingly beautiful, but Maria Luz possessed a radiance outshining her sister. Her skin, white and soft like gardenia petals, her cheeks like red roses, her jet black hair all wavy and shining, with all the beautiful charms and elegance of an extremely attractive lady. And due to her extraordinary beauty, and the valuable jewels she wore, she became known as the Golden Beauty. On the day of her 16th birthday, Don Alfonso and the Doña organized an elegant dance to celebrate the event and present her to society. All the aristocracy gathered with the military elite in the large ballroom of the mansion. The room was decorated in splendor. A magnificent orchestra filled the room as elegant couples danced under a canopy of ever-changing lights. Then the moment came as Maria Luz was introduced to society. As she descended the staircase, the orchestra began with a waltz. As she was escorted to the dance floor by a young Aciola, with all eyes fixed upon her, they began to dance before the rejoicing crowd. It was a wonderful night. Among the elegant guests there was a young man, who was considered an intimate friend of the Rodriguez family. His dark eyes and slightly wavy black hair framed his handsome face of brunette complexion. He wore the uniform of a captain major. This young man Maria Luz had known since childhood. And since then, a deep love has developed between them. As a younger man had planned to marry her and take her with him to Tegucigalpa, the capital city where an important role awaiting him. He appeared at Rodriguez mansion to ask Don Alfonso for her hand in marriage. After presenting his intentions to Don Alfonso's, his answer was not what the young man expected.
You say that you're thinking of marrying my daughter. We never expected you to undo your friendship this way. Which we truly feel is what would happen. Even though we think of you in the highest esteem, we cannot consent to that marriage.
His feelings hurt in the most intimate way, filled with shame and humiliation. He could not understand Don Alfonso's refusal. He fell silent for a moment, then with a tremble in his voice said,
Don Alfonso, I need an explanation. I need to know the reason why.
But Don Alfonso's answer left him void of any reason.
I feel in my soul, but I am not able to give you an explanation. I can never consent to such a union. I am deeply sorry, and I beg you not to talk of this matter again.
Don Alfonso and the Doña could not consent to the marriage because despite all the young man's qualities, he did not possess the racial requirement that matched the descendants of their family. In those days, families of noble origin did not allow their race to mix with another. It was because of this that they could not consent, and they forced Maria Luz to renounce that love. One day, Don Alfonso and the Doña welcomed into their home the gentleman Don Lino Chavez. Don Alfonso had been associated with him in business affairs, and despite having known each other for some time, this was Don Lino's first visit to the mansion. Don Lino's business ventures expanded from immense rural properties, brandy factories, and cattle ranches, which had made him a wealthy and illustrious person. In compliance with social etiquette, the Don and the Doña introduced him to their beautiful daughter, Luz Maria. At once, Don Lino was mesmerized by her beauty. Don Alfonso and the Doña felt extremely flattered, and hoped to marry their daughter to this gentleman who fulfilled all the qualities desired by them as a husband for their golden beauty. But Luz Maria could not accept the proposal of her parents, because her heart still belonged to the Captain Major. Besides, there was a great difference of age between them, with Don Lino being 30 years her senior.
You don't understand the valuable qualities of his personality.
Don Alfonso said.
You don't understand the importance of such a marriage to such an illustrious man.
But Luz Maria was unmoved. No. I could not marry that man in any way. For mercy's sake, I beg you not to destroy my heart anymore. In bitter anguish, she rushed to the loving arms of old Mama Chica. Sobbing against her chest, she asked, "Tell me what I should do. The deep wound in my heart for my lost love is still so alive inside me." She had always looked to Mama Chica for advice and comfort. Mama Chica held Luz Maria's face in her hands and said, looking straight into her eyes,
"Nothing. Do nothing, my child. Do nothing,"
as she rocked her in her arms. Don Lino was a man used to acquiring whatever he wished to have. Undoubted, he continued to frequently visit the Rodriguez mansion. Despite all his subtleties, his desire to possess Luz Maria weighed heavily on his mind. He found himself unable to find a persuasion to win her heart. And so as time passed and it seemed that along with him, her parents' intentions to marry her against her will were also passing. Luz Maria felt hope fill her spirit that her parents would never again ask her to marry a man she did not love. Don Lino, feeling defeated and burdened by the demands of his business ventures, left to return to San Esteban, but not without first promising the Doña that he would always be willing to marry her daughter. A few months later, the castle that she had formed in her soul, delirious with happiness and full of illusion, was to suddenly vanish. One day, with uncertain steps, while struggling to hide her grief, Mama Chica came towards her.
Little child, your mother wants to see you.
"What's wrong?" asked Maria Luz.
Mama Chica, is she not well?
Hurriedly she raced to her mother's room. Doña Florinda had been suffering from an unknown disease that caused her great pain. Don Alfonso had the finest doctors in all of Honduras to see her, but to no avail. She was dying. Luz Maria leaned in to hear her mother's voice.
Luz Maria, I beg you to listen calmly to what I am going to say. I call you to promise to marry Don Lino after my death. Don Chares is a true gentleman and a man of great importance. And I know he will make you happy, and with that hope I can die quietly.
Luz Maria looked at her mother, hiding the anguish of it all inside her.
If this is your last will, my mother, and with it, I give you tranquility, count on my promise, which will be fulfilled in accordance with your wishes.
As the Dona was approaching her final hour, she called upon to see Don Lino. After hearing what the Doña has to say to him, he promised to fulfill his marital commitment with the beautiful golden beauty. After a year of mourning, Don Lino came to the mansion to present unto Don Alfonso a dowry for the marriage. Maria Luz received her fiancé courteously, and with amazing energy, prepared everything necessary. She was determined to fulfill the promise she had made to her mother at her last moment. With admirable calm and in great silence, without uttering the slightest reproach, as she waited for the moment of her sacrifice. The ceremony was held in complete reserve at the request of the bride. Once the requirements concerning the marriage were completed, Don Lino returned to San Esteban, taking his beautiful wife, her sister Delfina, and Luz Maria's beloved Mama Chica. Don Alfonso, utterly destroyed by the suffering caused by the irreparable loss of the Dona, did not want to leave Juticalpa. Shortly after his daughters left his side, he died in the saddest of loneliness. Luz Maria felt the death of her father deep in her soul. And with more intensity she felt the cruelty of her destiny. After a while she understood that her only salvation consisted in resigning herself and fulfilling her obligation and duty as a wife. And little by little she became accustomed to the extreme feeling of true affection for her husband, who lovingly with special sweetness, pleased her in every way. Luz Maria became a loving wife, and 1 year after they married, she had her first child. Don Lino, as was the social norm, wanted to hire a wet nurse. But Luz Maria, who would not allow for a strange woman to care for her son. She and Mama Chica would care for and raise the child. He was baptized in the name of his father in splendor at the grandest church San Esteban. She and Don Lino felt intense happiness for the gift that God had rewarded them, this little angel, to glorify their home. One day, at about 4 o'clock in the morning, Luz Maria was awakened by the weak moans coming from her 3-year-old son's crib.
Don Lino, run, run, run.
Luz Maria was pregnant at the time of Lenito's death. And 2 months later, she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. The boy died just a few hours after birth. Rosara was the name given to the daughter with which she was baptized. She was as beautiful as Luz Maria, but when she reached her first year of age, was attacked by a fever so strong that it ravaged her. She survived, but the fever had left her with a disabled right hand and foot. 2 years after Rosara was born, Luz Maria had a son, who they baptized with the name Sebastian. This time fate did not inflict its powers over him. He grew completely healthy. The young man's white complexion, with intense bright eyes and wavy hair, highlighted his 6-foot frame. There was a certain sweetness in his eyes, but the depth of his pupils warned of a strong dominion demonstrated by an arrogant nobility. Life at home after the advent of her son Sebastian, in a peaceful calm, until one day. Luz Maria's sister, Delfina, pulled her aside to speak with her in a very quiet manner. She told her sister that she was in love with a man that neither she Luz Maria nor Don Lino would accept. That no matter what, she was determined to marry him, for she was madly in love. This young man was from a poor family, with a small farm just outside San Esteban, that was quite poor, barely giving them the means to live in limited poverty.
Delfina, do you know what you're saying? Do you realize how unfortunate your life will be? You're too young to think about marriage. Discard this absurd idea, little sister.
But Delfina paid no heed to the opposition of Luz Maria or of Don Lino. Instead, barely 16 years of age, the next morning, Delfina secretly left her home to go to her boyfriend's home and finalize her marriage. Luz Maria felt isolated. She understood that due to her sister's decision to marry below her station, they would never see each other again. Delfina, in her desolation, only found peace with Mama Chica. That lovely old lady came from time to time bringing money, food, or clothing that she secretly obtained. Delfina was tall, white, with silky skin like satin. She was not as pretty as her sister, but her figure gave the vision of an arrogant empress. She began to have child after child, resulting in a very large family. Only Mama Chica acted to lend her protection. She took great care to hide her coming and going from Don Lino. On one of those trips, Mama Chica began to feel strange. She begged Delfina to saddle her horse, thinking her end might be in sight. By this time, Mama Chica was well into her 80s. As she rode the hour-long journey, she began to weaken. Once back at the mansion, and in her room, Luz Maria found her beside an old chest.
Mama Chica, what's wrong? Are you sick? Why do you move so slowly?
No, I am not sick, my child, I'm dying. Help me with this chest.
Luz Maria, stunned in disbelief, helped the old lady open the chest that had sat by her bedside all these years. Mama Chica took out a large crucifix, golden, with an ivory Jesus.
This is for you, little sister of my soul, always look at it with great devotion.
Then she took out a picture of the Virgin Mary.
This is for Delfina, tell her to keep it as a memory of me. And this medal of the Virgin of Carmen is for Sebastian. And for one of the Sacred Heart of Jesus is for Rosara. Now my little one, call your husband and have him bring the priest here to me.
Don Lino did not believe that Mama Chica was dying, but he swiftly proceeded to fetch the priest to please his wife. When they returned, before her confession could be heard, she breathed her last breath with the words,
Luz Maria. Luz Maria.
The death of Mama Chica left her with a deep loneliness in her soul. Luz Maria no longer had that loving chest to rest on when she was looking for consolation in her most desperate moments. 6 months later, Don Lino announced that he decided to liquidate most of his holdings and move the family to the city of Euro. He decided to take advantage of the business opportunities that were there. He prepared everything in the most adequate manner to provide the greatest possible comfort for the family through the extended trek across the interior to the coast of Honduras. They left San Esteban, taking their cattle and mule beasts. The only way to travel at that time was by mule or on foot. They traveled with several boys along to mind the cattle. After 3 weeks, they arrived at the village of Benito, which was a short distance from the port city of Trujillo. Don Lino decided to stay in Benito for a season before continuing the trip, so he could make certain connections for the new businesses he planned to establish in Euro. It happened for reasons beyond his control, he found himself in need to stay. Luz Maria was now pregnant, and soon gave birth to a daughter they named Susanna. As soon as Luz Maria and Susanna were ready to travel, they continued their trip. They soon arrived at the port city of Trujillo. Through the many business relationships and good friends he had in the city, he sold off his cattle for a handsome profit. He had established several of these friendships over years of trade they conducted while his was in San Esteban. These friends convinced Don Lino to go to Porvenir and take advantage of the port and coastline to expand his business ventures. As for Luz Maria, she was delighted to move to Porvenir. She looked forward to establishing friendships with the families of the exalted class there that had maintained close relations to her parents. Don Lino expanded his ventures to include banana plantations, large tracts of land to plant pastures, and continued to breed cattle and mule beasts. He built a large warehouse in which he stocked all kinds of goods, from clothing and footwear to hardware, which proved to only increase his wealth. For his family, he purchased a huge property where he built a mansion even larger than the one in San Esteban. Everything seemed to be going so well for Luz Maria. She was blessed with the birth of another daughter they named Margarita. Don Lino had 2 children before he married Luz Maria. Both Carlos and Mariano joined the family in the mansion. Luz Maria raised these men into adulthood with the same tenderness she gave to her own children. Carlos and Mariano actively involved themselves in their father's business interests, especially when business called him away from home. All was right with their world, but all was not right in Honduras. That day, when the banana plantations had all their bushes laden with fruit, Don Lino had already started the harvest. The wagons, laden with clusters of ripe bananas, were taken to the port for export to the United States. Everything was ready for shipment as he awaited the arrival of his cargo ship. But as the ship was preparing to enter the harbor, an armed force led by a certain General Nuila began a revolutionary uprising to overthrow the Honduran government. The revolutionary forces took control of most of the Atlantic ports, including Porvenir. Don Lino, being in a perilous position as a capitalist, was forced by the leader of the rebel faction that took possession of the city to take charge of the political governance of the city. He had no sympathy for the rebels or their cause, but was pressed into their servitude. The rebellion at first made enormous success in gaining ground. But, as with so many revolts, government forces eventually overcame and destroyed them. Some managed to escape, and those who were captured were mostly shot. As for Don Lino, he was taken prisoner, and as luck would have it, he was taken to Trujillo to be tried as a traitor and collaborator of the revolution. Once imprisoned, he asked to be granted permission to communicate with his friends, some of which had great influence in the government. Don Pepe Julia, an immensely rich and influential nobleman, came to offer his assistances and consult to Don Lino. Don Pepe knew that the charges against his friend were unfounded and vowed to aid him in his defense. Meanwhile, once Don Lino had been arrested, Carlos and Mariano took Luz Maria and her 4 children aboard a schooner to whose captain they paid a large sum to sail them to safety in Trujillo. Don Lino stood trial defended by esteemed counsel, as provided by the commission of Don Pepe. They argued that Don Lino had always been a gentleman of unquestionable honor and loyalty to the nation, that he was totally blameless for the demands pressed upon him during the insurrection. They implored the justice to grant Don Lino a pardon. After a brief deliberation, he decided to grant the request. During his time in prison, Don Lino was isolated from his family. Luz Maria and the children had taken refuge amongst friends in Trujillo. The days went by with no word of Don Lino's fate. His 2 sons, Carlos and Mariano, feeling that Luz Maria and the children would be safe, returned to Porvenir, to the mansion, where they gathered the remaining cattle and returned the workers to the plantations and the fields for planting. And along with the re-employed servants, they put the household back in order. Upon his release from prison, Don Pepe in a jovial manner told him he had learned the whereabouts of his family from Carlos, and with no hesitation escorted him to rejoin his family. Once back in the mansion, Don Lino together with his sons continued to cultivate their various business ventures. Because of the expansion of his business dealings, he was obliged to travel frequently to various places throughout the region, usually accompanied by Carlos. But when he needed to travel to Trujillo, he usually took Luz Maria along with him. Don Lino and the beautiful golden beauty, Luz Maria, were a very elegant couple, always dressed in the highest of fashion. Sometimes these trips lasted up to a week. And along with the business meetings, they also, by necessity, attended all the social events. For Don Lino, these events became a real torment for him. For wherever they went, she was openly admired for her beauty. And they congratulated Don Lino for the good luck he had had to marry a woman so young and beautiful. To those great compliments, his resentment towards the admiration that other men bestowed upon his wife began to fester into jealousy. Don Lino could not avoid traveling. His business obligations required him to do so. He insisted on taking her on these trips, even against her will. He had become driven by mistrust that had powerfully dragged him into the imbalance of jealousy. It happened on a Sunday morning. For some time, Don Lino's growing mistrust had caused his nerves to the limits of their tolerance. At breakfast time, as the whole family was preparing to take their places in the dining room, all were present, with the exception of Mariano. Don Lino's house rules had become very strict. One rule was nobody could sit down to eat until everyone was gathered. As they waited, Mariano's absence became prolonged in the eyes of Don Lino. He ordered his servant boy to find and fetch Mariano to his presence. A few minutes later, he returned with a look of astonishment all over his face. The boy in a most excited way said that Mariano was not in his room. Instead, there is a very pretty lady there. In disbelief, he rushed out of the dining room, headed for his son's room. He rushed into the room and in fact there was a beautiful young woman standing there. Her beauty took him by surprise, but after a moment he collected himself as best he could, and asked her most severely,
"Who are you, and who brought you here?"
Trembling in fear in the presence of Don Lino, she slowly looked up to him and said,
"My name is Dina. I am Mariano's girlfriend. Forgive me, sir. I've been so blind because of the love I feel for him, that I could not see that last night was a great mistake. Please, sir, forgive me. Mariano left to find a place for us to hide."
As she hurried past him through the bedroom door, Don Lino stood there still startled, filling with rage. Just seconds later, Mariano came in the room, not expecting to find his father. Don Lino could not control his nerves. Enraged by the lack of respect, he harshly scolded him, citing the horrible example he had set for his younger brothers, and the injustice of dishonoring that innocent creature. He rebuked him and then sent him into Trujillo to bring back a priest to marry them. Dina was a descendant of a very fine family of means from the nearby village of La Brea, where by tradition she was very acceptable as a wife. They were married in the courtyard of the mansion. Fortunately, it became a good marriage for them both. But Don Lino's mood only darkened as he had become a tyrant to all in the household. Critical of any infraction, he felt it was a personal disrespect. His unfounded mistrust and jealousy towards Luz Maria caused him to berate her, and everyone in the household, all the way down to the servants. In that same year, 1899, a new century was on the horizon. All over the country, there was an overwhelming enthusiasm to welcome in the 20th century. And in Trujillo, on New Year's Eve, the commander and Governor Don Fausto Lusky hosted a gala ball at his residence. It was the most exclusive event, attended by all the wealthy and important people in the region. Don Lino knew his obligations required him and Luz Maria to attend. Luz Maria, radiant in her finest formal wear, Don Lino was dressed properly with the refinement of an aristocratic gentleman. The evening was filled with music and dancing as the elite welcomed in the new year, but not for Luz Maria. Don Lino insisted they leave immediately, for he could no longer listen to or observe the admiration being bestowed upon his wife. His temper, fueled by his jealousy, blinded his reason. Once back in the mansion, Don Lino followed Luz Maria into her bedroom. He was no longer in control of himself. In a jealous rage, he bellowed,
"I can't do it anymore. I prefer you to be dead. You disrespect me in the company of others. I'll kill you."
Luz Maria screamed for help, which woke the children. The little ones appeared at her door. Once he realized their presence, he rushed them out the door. And as he left, he locked it and put the key in his pocket. The next morning, the first day of the new century arrived. Luz Maria found herself locked in her room. Don Lino would not allow her freedom, only her imprisonment. He forbade anyone to enter the room in the strictest of manners. He, and only he, would tend to her needs. He had totally cut her off from any outside contact. He descended into lunacy, consumed by his jealousy and imagined suspicion of everyone around him. And for a few months all in the household trembled in fear whenever in his presence. He began to neglect his businesses to the point that he had to travel again to the immediate villages. He would leave in the morning and return the same day. All the time, leaving Luz Maria alone, imprisoned in her room. One day he could not return to the mansion on the same day. His children, desperate for the sad situation of their poor mother, enlisted Carlos and Sebastian to forcefully break her bedroom door open. They decided that she needed to escape along with Sebastian to head out to the interior of Honduras to flee from her husband. Don Lino had been delayed by 3 days in Trujillo, and in his haste, he became fearful that in his absence Luz Maria might have died. Upon his arrival, all his children were waiting for him with marked anxiety.
"What's happened?"
he asked. All the children remained silent. Confused, he raced up the stairs to find Luz Maria's door open. He stood there in astonishment for a moment before returning downstairs to confront his children.
"I order you all to tell me where my wife is. Who opened the door to her room?"
he demanded. His son Carlos answered him.
I opened that door. Rather, I broke it down to free her from the prison you placed her in. You left her dying of hunger. You left her dying of thirst. As to where she went to, I don't know. We only know she left with Sebastian early in the morning while we all were sleeping,"
he said, protecting the rest of the children's involvement in freeing their mother. Taken back by his son's rebuke, he called for his butler to freshen his horse to pursue Luz Maria. Then he ordered Carlos to bring him the money box to gather funds to take with him. When Carlos presented the box, the lock had been broken and the money was gone. With no regard for his family or his businesses, he left in great haste, believing that Luz Maria and Sebastian were heading to the port of Trujillo, in hopes of boarding a schooner for the islands in the bay. He arrived in Trujillo, and constantly traversed the streets frantically searching for them. Convinced that they were not in the city, he decided to spend days at the seaside by the harbor in hopes that she would return on one of the schooners that arrived daily. Totally exhausted and disappointed, he returned to the mansion. Upon his return, the mania that possessed him led him to disregard his obligations. For the next few weeks, he exhausted all means of finding her. Then it occurred to him that maybe she would send a letter to her children. He ordered one of his servants to travel daily to Trujillo to collect the mail. Unexpectedly, once he had given up all hope, the letter arrived. Luz Maria wrote, "Don Lino, I can no longer endure this separation from my children. I'm in the home of Don Canales. I am under their protection. I intend to stay here until you decide what you want to do. If you want me to return to you, bring me the children and perhaps we all can return together. I want you to know that I and my children will never allow the suffering and the torment you inflicted on us to ever happen again. Don Lino immediately, without stopping for a second to consider her wishes, called to Carlos to get the horses ready, for they were going to San Esteban to return Luz Maria. Carlos slowly turned to his father and told him that he would not go with him. He would accompany him to Trujillo to aid him in his affairs for the trip. But after that, he was leaving for Ruatan to accept the position of inspector that he managed to obtain. Dumbfounded, Don Lino realized his abandonment of his children. In a moment of clarity, he told Carlos,
I understand that I have been unfair to you. I've disregarded my duties as a father. Forgive me. May God bless you and always accompany you and enlighten your path.
Then he slid back into his mania.
But you will never understand the intensity of my suffering that your mother has caused.
With that, they departed for Trujillo. After collecting the necessary provisions for the journey, Don Lino gathered up his 3 daughters and departed for San Esteban. Along the way, he had time to think about his situation. He had no doubt that Luz Maria would return with him. After all, she was his wife. But how to keep his inner anger and jealous judgment inside him? He would behave in the manner he had before his descent into madness. Luz Maria was astounded by the change in character of Don Lino upon his arrival. But the sight of her daughters filled her with great joy. Luz Maria heard what Don Lino had to say. He begged forgiveness for the injustice he had brought down on her and the children. Without explaining his actions, he swore that it would never happen again. Luz Maria wanted to believe him, so for the sake of her children, she agreed to return home. The first few months, it seemed that all that past, the painful tortures they had lived through, had been a horrible nightmare turned to a normal life again. The little girls enjoyed playing in the meadows, chasing butterflies, with their hearts filled with exhilarating enthusiasm, as if life was smiling upon them again. Luz Maria, the beautiful golden beauty, began to harbor a small hope that encouraged her broken heart. Time continued to pass by peacefully, the household was at rest, and the girls had grown to be beautiful young ladies. Don Lino was behaving like a perfect gentleman again. He showed kindness not only to his wife and children, but also the servants and the peasants from the nearby villages. But from time to time, Luz Maria saw something dark behind his eyes that gave her a shiver when she saw it. Don Lino no longer seemed to desire to expand his businesses, yet he tended to his obligations diligently. He found he enjoyed the admiration the villagers honored him with. At first, his kindness was unbounded, but after time, the number of visits to his mansion increased along with the needs of the peasants. He began to feel suspicion and mistrust towards the very people that truly respected him. After a while, this new madness possessed him. He felt that he needed to take his family away again, to a new place. He decided to inform Luz Maria of his intentions. Listening to him, she could not help but be astonished, despite all her calm.
What are you saying, Don Lino? You want to leave, because misery has dragged us down? Whatever are you talking about? And you assumed I'd accept your crazy delusion? That you believe I would follow you? No, Don Lino, don't continue to pursue this insane proposition. I warn you, I'm determined to remain right here.
Don Lino was very surprised. With anger he approached her.
If I force you, what could you do? Since when have you thought about opposing your husband? Have you forgotten your duty to follow and obey me?
No, Don Lino, answered Luz Maria. That time has ended. All my life I have obeyed you, considering my duty and fearing you so much. For that fear you filtered into my being. And now through your outlandish behavior, that I'd hope was behind you. No, I will not follow your absurd notions.
Apparently you are determined to stay here. But as I cannot stay here, I will go alone, or rather I'll take Sebastian. Perhaps when we return you would have had a change of heart for fuller duties as my wife.
Luz Maria's head was spinning as she tried to comprehend what was happening.
No, Don Lino, you will not take Sebastian, I will never let you take him. I prefer death to my poor son being taken away from me.
Don Lino, with an icy stare devoid of sanity, said.
It does not matter, you have no say here. I am growing old, and I need him to accompany me, to aid me in my pursuit. Remain here, take the time to find yourself and be prepared to travel upon our return.
And with that he began to make preparations for the trip. After all was in place, he departed with Sebastian and a boy servant he called Jacinto, and headed for San Esteban to meet Don Coronado with the intention to liquidate his holdings. Once they arrived in San Esteban, Don Lino found his friend Don Coronado in great cheer. He listened to Don Lino's proposal intently and was interested in what he offered. Instead, he offered he would send Don Lino the money once he had sold off the properties and the cattle. Don Lino was overjoyed with the arrangement, and after a few days he departed along with Sebastian and Jacinto for the trip home. But along the way home he became disoriented and began to become quite ill. As the trip continued, he became weakened and very sick. Once they returned, he had to take to his bed. He was deteriorating rapidly and called for his children. Luz Maria, despite her feeling towards him, she decided to dedicate herself to his care. But it was useless. Don Lino was dying.
My children, Sebastian, try to follow the right path, be good and take care of your mother. She is a saint, she has suffered greatly because of me. Take care of your sisters too. Rosara, my poor daughter, stop those bad habits of yours that are a real torment to your poor mother and sisters and those around you. And Susanna, my love, my ray of sunshine, someday you will find great happiness, till then obey your mother as you have always had. Margarita, continue being by your mother's side, for she will need you in the coming days. Luz Maria, I feel my last moment is approaching. I'm sorry for all the sadness that I have brought down on you. Go to San Esteban, to Don Coronado, he has the money he owes me due to our transaction, it is plenty for you and the children.
He said with his last breath as he perished. The rain began to fall and the thunder began to roar. Now with Don Lino no longer alive to take care of his family, and without the wealth that Don Lino liquidated before his death, Luz Maria, now 40 years of age, asked Sebastian to aid her in making preparations to travel to San Esteban to collect the money from Don Coronado. But once she had met Don Coronado, she was faced with the difficulty that he did not have the amount of money he owed to her for Don Lino. So, he offered the solution of, instead of cash, to give her a few donkeys and some merchandise, such as leather, cheese, beans, and other items appropriate to take and sell at the capital city of Tegucigalpa. Luz Maria understood that the idea was quite sound. She had no qualms about accepting his offer. Once the loads were ready, she and Sebastian left for the trip to Tegucigalpa. The adventure turned out to be a blessing. She was very successful and realized a sizable profit from her transactions. Before leaving Tegucigalpa, she wanted to fulfill a duty. She wanted to go to the presidential palace to greet the president. Such an audience required a permit, which was easily granted, due her honorable character. She had another reason to meet the first president of the Republic of Honduras, for as fate would have it, the president was none other than the Captain Major. The same man that had asked for her hand only to be turned down by Don Alfonso and the Doña for being of humble ancestry beneath their standards. Once again in her presence, as he gazed upon her divine face, despite the time that passed, saw her in the glowing beauty of his memory. And after hearing about the difficulties of her life since they last saw each other, he found himself ecstatic yet deeply moved by her visit. As she rose to depart, he wished her goodbye with the greatest of fondness, and told her that if she should find herself in need, to be sure that he became aware of it. With that, they said their goodbyes. Not long after their return to Porvenir, the president of Honduras sent Sebastian an appointment to the port city of La Ceiba. La Ceiba was growing fast with its ports filled with trade traveling both in and out of the city. His mother was both filled with pride for her son and sorrow at the thought of his departure. With great strength she, with the help of her butler Señor Hector, prepared for the journey. In the company of Jacinto, they left early one morning. Luz Maria had over time managed to keep her business matters productive, aided by her trustworthy butler. Hector had been by Don Lino's side for many years and acted as his personal secretary on many occasions. As for her daughters, Susana and Margarita aided their mother in managing the household servants. There was no longer the opportunity to attend the lavish balls of Trujillo. But frequently Luz Maria, along with Susana and Margarita, would attend the Sunday concerts in the park. The girls delighted in this outing, spying the dashing young men in the park. On one of these occasions a young man approached Luz Maria and her daughters. This young man, José Montalvo, was from Catacamas. And a few years ago, his family had visited theirs frequently at the mansion. He addressed Luz Maria warmly.
Madam, what a great pleasure to see you again. I remember those trips to your home with great fondness. We were so sorry to hear of Don Lino's passing. And don't tell me that these are your daughters. I remember you as children.
As he spoke to them his eyes focused on Susana. She had truly grown into a beauty as lovely as her mother. Little did José know that she had as a child a deep affection for him.
So, what of you, José? What brings you here? Are you employed or in private business?
I'm presently a schoolteacher. But I plan to resign and devote myself to other issues that will give me better results.
After the concert ended, he walked them back home, promising to visit again. And every day after that he visited. His affection for Susana was so great, and she also felt affected by his visits that they fell in love. But José knew that a schoolteacher's salary would not do. He needed a higher station in life if he hoped to marry her. He had to resign his position to pursue a better situation. He departed and managed to find a bookkeeper's job at a very important business house in La Ceiba. He then returned to ask Luz Maria for Susana's hand in marriage, which she readily agreed to. They were married and José took his new bride back with him to La Ceiba. Luz Maria watched as they departed holding back her tears as she prayed for them and also herself. With Susana married and gone, Luz Maria, along with Margarita, continued to live in and manage the household. But her other daughter Rosaura, due to her infliction of deformity, had always been hateful to those around her. But in spite of her physical deformation, she was a beautiful woman, with piercing eyes adorning the pearl whiteness of her face. She seemed to lose reason more and more each month, eventually becoming more and more disturbed. She cried, often complaining to Luz Maria that she did not love her. She insulted and hated everyone. She eventually died after slipping into total derailment. Shortly after Rosaura died, it had been some time since she had heard from Sebastian. The last thing she had heard from him was that after he had become disillusioned with La Ceiba, he left to find his fortune elsewhere. But with no success he had encountered the poorest of luck. Luz Maria, through influential friends that still held Sebastian in high esteem, and because of their consideration of her virtues. Noting of course her indelible seal of noble birth, they arranged for him to take the position of an accountant at a large sugar refinery back in La Ceiba. Then one day, one of the friends who had aided her in obtaining Sebastian employment came to her home. His expression betrayed his deep sorrow. Her heart shrank inside her when she realized what he may have come to tell her. In the privacy of her sitting room, he softly said to her,
Sebastian had taken ill while working diligently and deep into the night every evening. His condition was not improving, and he had developed a tremendous fever. It had gotten to the point that the company ordered him to go by train to the company hospital there in La Ceiba. At a train stop, unnoticed by the drivers, Sebastian in his fevered delirium wandered off towards the mountains. They looked for him around the mountains and along the railway line but could not find a trace of him. Search parties looked for weeks until they found his body. Doña Chairs, it pains me to say that his body was so taken by the elements that we were forced to bury him right there where he died.
With that he again expressed his condolences as he left her to her shock and grief. A few months after Sebastian's death, Margarita, her youngest daughter, who had fallen in love with a young mercantile expert named Frandino Carci. He was well-mannered and kept the accounts for all the commercial houses in La Ceiba. And because of his true honesty, all the merchants placed their trust in him. He had just received a government appointment to the position of Revenue Administrator of La Ceiba. He and Margarita planned to get married. Luz Maria, though saddened by the thought of no longer having Margarita with her anymore, cheerfully gave her blessing for them to marry. Over the years Margarita gave birth to 2 boys and 3 girls. And Frandino was appointed the political governor of the port of La Ceiba. The government then appointed him deputy of Congress in the capital city of Tegucigalpa, a position more suited to his category of honor. As fate would have it, the dark clouds began to gather again. Margarita developed a fatal chest condition that eventually took her life. Her children were entrusted to the care of Luz Maria. They lived with her, and she raised them to adulthood. In the year 1916, Susanna had already given birth to 3 daughters: Cristina, Sylvia, and Mercedes. At the time, Jose, although he continued to work as a bookkeeper for the same commercial house, the owners recognizing his extensive knowledge and management skills, was rewarded with a doubling of his salary. But his true enthusiasm lay in the politics of the time. Revolution and reform were sweeping across the Americas, and Honduras was no exception. General Don Manuel Bonilla had returned from Guatemala with his strengthened forces, with whom he successfully overthrew the liberal government. General Bonilla was now the president of the republic. Jose, while still in the employment of the commercial house, bought a small printing press to handle the commercial announcements of the business. But he started a publication. As a loyalist, he published considerable serious and fairly extensive articles that caused grave concerns to the opposing party. He became very popular with the people due to his publications fighting for their prosperity and protection. The enemies of the new government found his influence on the coming elections a real hindrance to their hidden intentions. With no other way to silence him, they employed a paid assassin to murder him. So, one night as he was working on a new article he was approached from behind, and in a muffled stillness he was struck down. The murderer committed his crime in the most villainous of fashion. But he was soon apprehended and sentenced to life imprisonment. Susanna, who had just given birth to their 4th daughter, Selena, found herself a widow, way before her time. Finding herself dazed and disoriented and afraid of the atmosphere of danger that swarmed around her, had no choice but to leave La Ceiba. She gathered together what little funds she had and decided to leave Honduras for the United States. She arrived in the port city of New Orleans, where she struggled not knowing the English language to provide for her daughters. Then one day she met a man named Santos Arroyo, and after 5 years in New Orleans, they moved to New York City, where she established herself with a catering business in the Latino neighborhood in which they lived. Then some 40 years later, she decided to write the story of her mother's life. The Golden Beauty.